Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn session. I'm going to allow folks a few seconds to join. I'm so happy to have those of you joining us today. And thank you to those of you who attended the last Lunch and Learn, our substitute session with the LA Urban Center for Natural Resource Sustainability, the Spring Partners meeting that included a presentation by our visiting scholar on equity, Vivek Shandas, as well as Cindy Chen on that project team and some fellows. If you weren't able to attend, I highly recommend, I believe it's on the City Plant's YouTube site currently and will be posted to the LA Urban Center eventually, but was a lovely event and had some really great discussion in the breakout groups that they held, as well as sharing some really interesting information, both from the researcher and from those fellows that did some really interesting projects with the LA Urban Center as part of their fellows program. So today I wanted to take some time to go and look at the guidebook with you all. Obviously, again, you can go back and see Vivek's presentation and Cindy's presentation as part of that event. And we will be having other members of the project team probably come on lunch and learn sessions or other opportunities to hear directly from them about the project. But since the report is still relatively new and it is available to you on the City Plant's website, and I'll go ahead and pop in the chat the link to that. Go ahead and pop in the link to the document. I had it up here, but when I share my screen, I lose the ability to see all the buttons right away. So there's the phase 2 guidebook for our equity project. I'm going to go ahead and switch my screen share to show you the document, and we're going to look through it together. And I just want to share some of the things that I'm noticing as we have now access to this wonderful report. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the project team. This was a project funded by Accelerate Resilience Los Angeles that came through the LA Urban Center and Tree People and was managed by City Plants and had, again, Vivek Shandas and Kappa Strategies. Stas provided some of the different visuals that you'll see in the document, and Tree People, Edith de Guzman, who's a PhD candidate at UCLA, myself, Amy Schulenberg from LA Sanitation, and a few others. I'm sure I haven't listed everyone, but it was a wonderful project team that went through and took that first phase, which was an equity assessment, and then developed this wonderful guidebook. So again, in the chat, you have an option to go ahead and look at it yourself. You can see I'm on the City Plants website right now. And what I want to talk about really briefly is the tiered approach, and then show a couple of the renderings. One of the things I really loved about this project in our work towards equity for the City of Los Angeles, addressing the mayor's goal for us to increase tree canopy in areas of greatest need by 50% by 2028. We have obviously our wonderful partnership with Google, the USC Urban Trees Initiative that presented at the Tree Summit last week. And then we also have this project, and all of them are playing a different role in helping us better understand the issue of canopy and equity in Los Angeles and how we might take our next steps forward in addressing it. And so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go down to the page that talks about the tiers. And so again, this is page 8 and 9 in the document. And we have these 3 tiers. The first is, again, what space is available on a street. You go to the street, there's an open parkway or an open tree well that meets the city spacing guidelines. You can plant it with, funding for the plant itself, and for that establishment care, we could plant it today. Tier 2, we have what they've classified as moderate. So this is, again, LA Sanitation and the environment frequently has obtained grants to do concrete cuts. And those are what we're really thinking about here are areas where some slight site modifications that require some additional financial resources in order to achieve greening in those spaces. But again, no need to change city guidelines or policies. We can plant there if we have some slight addition of resources to open up something like a new tree well. And then the tier 3, which we're just calling hard, and this is kind of a catch-all, is what happens when we go to a site and there either isn't current opportunity for tree planting, or the current opportunity for tree planting in the form of open available space or easily modified space doesn't get us to our canopy targets. So this, I'll just say right now, I've been talking a lot over the past lunch and learn sessions about the need for large stature trees, not in planting stock. We're not talking about planting 48-inch box trees, but we're talking about the potential of the plant to grow to be a large tree, a tree species that typically grows to be large given the appropriate site conditions. So that's part of what we're looking at here is what are we going to get some of the desired outcomes with planting small trees, and where are we going to have additional interventions? And sometimes where do we see that even with the current guidelines and parkway sizes and concrete cuts that we can do within our standard plan to the city, when that isn't going to be necessarily enough to achieve our tree planting goals. And I'll add that part of their analysis included private property planting. So we aren't just looking at the public right of way, we're also looking at planting on private property. So this tier 3 is where we've got some work to do. Where are we going to put in different trade-offs if we want to achieve certain canopy targets? And those are the conversations I really look forward to having moving forward. And I feel like this report gave us a lot of really great information to add fuel to those internal and external conversations, both with city stakeholders and staff, our urban planning and engineers and others that have different perspectives of the public right-of-way and other spaces, and then also with our communities, because we know that trees are an important resource for shade, cooling, and other benefits, including habitat value and stormwater capture. And again, every time I could go on and on about the benefits of trees, but we need to have a conversation about if we're going to have tree canopy in some neighborhoods, what are some of the trade-offs that we're going to be looking at? And in some cases, again, a tier 1, just planting available locations will get us to our desired canopy targets. But if we can't, how do we start to have those conversations about these tier 3 or hard locations where we may need to have some policy changes or significant city investment or other investment to change our spaces? So that's kind of one of the critical pieces that this guidebook puts forward, is this thought of looking at sites in terms of these tiers. Is it a place where we can go ahead and plant right now? Is this a place that needs site modifications? Or is this an area where we have some significant work to do to achieve our tree planting goals? And over here, you kind of see this graph that looks at the effort and investment that we have to put forward to achieve certain project types, and then the amount of greening potential. As a kind of a loose way to start to think about, we could go out and plant trees, but is it going to achieve the kinds of greening benefits that we want and levels that we want? And that's again why I appreciate Mayor Garcetti's leadership in not just saying we're going to plant 90,000 trees, but also giving us a target for increasing tree canopy in areas of greatest need, because we know that just saying we checked the box, we planted 90,000 trees, that isn't going to be necessarily enough to reach certain canopy targets if we're not very strategic about it. So with that in mind, we're going to go down and again, here we have our typical parkway situation where someone has planted a new young tree. So that's again a tier 1. The analysis that Cindy Chen did through her GIS work looked at, and again, she spoke extensively about this in the webinar from the last time, but we're looking at here what happens if we plant all available street tree and private property tree locations, assuming no canopy loss, which we know is a big assumption. We know that we have trees that are coming to the end of their life cycle, may have reasons that they need to be removed. And again, that's why in the lunch and learn sessions, I talk about the needs for investment in maintenance and preservation, because we know that those are really important as well for our urban forest. But she looked at if we plant new trees on private property and in the public right-of-way based on the spacing guidelines that UFD currently has, our urban forestry division, what is the outcome if we plant? And they had to assume small stature trees because the scope of this project didn't allow enough time to look at how many of these locations could take a medium or large tree. But when it came to small stature trees, they were able to see that only one council district would we be able to hit the target of increasing canopy by 50% by planting all available locations. Again, with a small tree, and with small trees, we're looking at a 15-foot diameter. So again, medium and large trees significantly change that. And I know that that's the hope of the future of this work, is to start to tease out some of those details. And I know that we'll be able to do that within the city somewhat as we continue to get our tree inventory data. As we move forward to completing our street tree inventory, it includes data on vacant locations, including the parkway size, which for us tells us some information. We have the parkway size, we know whether or not there's overhead power lines, we can then start to determine, do we have the ability to put a small, medium, or large tree in place? So there's more great information here, but I do want to scroll down to just a couple of the case studies. So, and I'm actually going to zoom in here a little bit on this, and I'll just say as a caveat, when you look at this document, when you go through the guidebook, these are not currently planned projects. That's not the aim. The aim was to look at some sites that those of us were aware of as ones that had either greening potential or some real challenges to greening, and start to imagine what we might need to do and how we might better describe kind of what I look at, or what Amy Schulenberg looks at and other urban foresters look at when we go to a site. You know, people say, you know, oh, you could put a ton of trees here. My block has no trees. Let's let's get a bunch more trees over here. And the truth is that sometimes it's just not possible. So, and I think it's helpful for you all to see that perspective. So this is a tier 1 location, the Wayland Avenue. I'm actually going to make sure that I can scroll over here so you can actually see the existing conditions. So we have this, we see what the historic redlining was. It was redline desirable. This one is one of the few that wasn't in, the lower categories. But we see that it has a very low canopy cover currently. So, and we see as we look on the street, we have a lot of yards and parkways that are not planted, which again, I think we'd have to do some future works on some social barriers to trees in this space. But you see here, wow, there may be space for a significant number of trees. And so we have some notes here within the document that kind of show you what I might see when I go to the space. Wow, there's a lot of driveways here, and they're pretty frequent down the block. And we know that we have to be a certain distance from driveways in order to allow for appropriate visibility. And there's, some new street trees that are planted on this block. There's going to be some shade provided. There's some concerns maybe from the public around who's maintaining that tree, if it's getting sufficient maintenance, whether or not there's going to be other complaints like we hear litter or bird poop on their car, those kinds of things. So, and you see those here, some of the challenges. There's also some potential utility conflicts and our street lights. So this is one case where, again, we have some space for trees that are displayed here, and some of the things that might go through our minds as we look at that space. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to another one of the case studies where I'll skim past these, where you get some other, you can see the great visuals that were developed by the project team. But I actually want to go down towards the bottom, and I want to look at these ones. So Mountain View is one that I've brought up a number of times to folks. This is actually in Huntington Park, so not in the city of Los Angeles, but it was one of the ones that was really a turning point for me in terms of thinking about urban canopy and equity. This is part of an area where I was doing a project when I was at Tree People. We looked at planting every available planting location in that city and found that, one, it was only going to increase the tree canopy by 1.5% if we planted every street tree location that was available, because all of them were 4-foot wide or smaller parkways, or it was a 6-foot wide parkway with an overhead power line, which again, those are places where we can only plant small trees. The thing that really struck me about Mountain View is you see the school at the end of the street. And this is a corridor where you would see parents walking their children to school on a daily basis from the main corridor. And the truth is they had no space in their public right-of-way within the development within that city for additional street trees, and some very limited space for front yard trees. And for me as an urban forester, I went, we're going to have to have other experts, other types of expertise inform us on how we shade critical corridors like this one, or having that conversation with the community. This is an area where parking is a huge issue, so losing parking spaces is probably not something that people are open to, but it made me feel uncomfortable to be greening a community and providing those benefits and not being able to do something about a corridor like this that I know is heavily used by parents going to and from school. And we weren't able to provide any additional shade or protection to them through the course of a very significant project that we've done with communities. So this is again a rendering where we talk about there might be some need to look at these trade-offs for different ways that we could explore adding canopy there. But even with that, you see that there's a very minimal addition. So that doesn't say that we can't plant or add canopy there. But again, this is a starting point for some conversations about, again, with community and with other types of experts, how can we look at these spaces and design them or put in guidelines and policies that allow us to provide those really critical parts of our infrastructure, the trees that can provide shade and those other benefits. I'm just going to look at one more and then we'll go to Q&A. So if you do have a question related to the guidebook or to this equity issue, feel free to put it in the Q&A section. And we'll go to those in just a moment. This last one is this Wilmington and Anaheim intersection. Again, not a planned project by the city, but just an intersection that represented some typical conditions that we wanted to have the project team explore, look at, and think about. So again, the existing tree canopy of the area is very low, 3.21%, and we've got a fairly high average heat health action index. And we have here, again, some of the conditions. We have overhead power lines, and I think we see that on the next slide here. We have the overhead power lines. I'm actually going to zoom in so you can see a little bit better if you're looking on your screen. We have a commercial and industrial land use, which is not always conducive to additional trees on the private property side. We have the overhead power lines, which really limits how big of a plant we can put in the space. If we do have space for a larger tree, if there's overhead power lines, we can't put one in. Again, many driveway aprons and potential utility conflicts, which again, you get into as you start to develop a project. You have Dig Alert come out and mark the sidewalk with those different colorful notes. And part of being an urban forester is learning how to read those and know what they're telling us about the underground infrastructure. And then beyond that, there just isn't a lot of room for additional plants. And you can see that in the actual image of the site. You have one small tree that's been planted, and it's really limited to only putting small trees on this section of street because of the width of the sidewalk. We couldn't put in a larger tree wall here because there isn't sufficient space in the existing conditions. So you want to have enough soil volume for that tree to grow healthy, large as that species gets to. And in these site conditions, you're not going to be able to put a large species tree. So, and we also, again, have some additional power lines here. We don't want to have additional issues there. So looking at those kind of cases and thinking through and better describing, again, I'm saying verbally what you're going to see here on the page, but allowing us to have some really great visuals to think about and consider kind of the constraints in this public right-of-way. And again, knowing that public right-of-way is not the only option, we're also looking at private property trees and their appropriate placement and planting, and then other interventions that the city may explore. And so again, we have some of the trade-offs, some of the things for us to think about as we look at these different options. One is this industrial, commercial zoning areas don't have a huge financial incentive with our current policies to improve their street trees or to add additional trees on their side of the property line. Again, we have these power line conflicts. Is this an area where we can think about reducing the travel lane? Maybe, maybe not. These are major corridors through some of our neighborhoods. And I know that we'll be looking at the mobility plan and other resources to think through where we have those trade-offs and opportunities to put in additional trees. And you can see in the rendering here some of the thoughts. If you were to do some bump out or lose some of that traffic space to provide a healthy soil volume for trees and maybe allow for additional plants to be put in. Again, not something that we're necessarily saying is the answer, but intended to help us think through what are the options in these spaces, and then maybe have the conversation afterwards of if we can't put trees, sufficient trees or shade in these public right-of-way spaces, and we have these private property limitations, where do we go from here? What are the policy shifts that are needed or incentives that may be needed for us to get some additional shade in these areas? So I'm going to go ahead and look at the Q&A. We've got one question in the Q&A currently from anonymous attendee. Are you able to estimate how many trees could be planted for a particular street like Mountain View under a tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 scenario? These types of stats would be helpful for us to find philanthropic and grant funding for this type of work. Agreed. And I think that that's the project team, which is currently calling themselves the Urban Forest Equity Collective, is thinking about next steps for this project and looking to procure funding for another phase of this work, which would include things probably like looking at park space and other components that we didn't explore in this current project. And this is one of the things that I think is under discussion is, can we talk about the number of trees and the cost of those trees? And the other thing I'm really interested in is the change in benefits. So if we do a tier 1 on a Mountain View, This is the amount of canopy that's added. If we do a tier 2, we can get a canopy up to this. And if we do a tier 3, this is the canopy that we get. And we can start to look at those trade-offs and have a conversation. Here's kind of the cost that we anticipate for this type of a project intervention, but this is the ultimate benefit. And then being able to look at that context, which you saw here, we had the current tree canopy and the current heat health action index number for that community, in addition to an understanding of whether or not it fell within an area that had historic disinvestment due to redlining, being able to kind of weigh all those factors together and have a conversation about what kind of intervention we might want to look at, not just in terms of, again, that cost benefit perspective, but also from the community perspective. What benefits are they hoping to receive from trees? What look and feel do they want in their neighborhood? And what kinds of interventions feel the most consistent with the needs of that space? Because we know that there are a lot of different uses in our public space. And that's a part of the conversation going forward, is going to communities and starting to talk to them about what things seem like a good trade-off to them, or that they'd be interested in discussing. Great question, though. I don't see any other questions, so feel free to add some in the Q&A if you have another one. I'm going to go ahead and zoom back out a little bit. I do want to just take a moment, and I didn't want to start at the last page. We do have some great next steps in here that you can go ahead and read, but I wanted to just show you that visual that we have now of some of the way that an urban forester might look at a space when we go to inspect it for tree planting, and again, some of the challenges that we face. But I'll show our kind of our NASCAR page, as we joke sometimes, with our logos of the wonderful partners that were a part of this project, and really helped make this great work possible, and allowed us to start to create these visuals that will allow us to have conversations again with city staff and with our community members. So with that, that's pretty much what I had to share today, because you know that I like to leave time for questions. I don't see additional questions at this point, but I'm willing to hang on for another minute or two in case we have other folks that want to hear more about this project specifically. I'm giving you time to type, and maybe I should have included a poll today to get some additional feedback from you all, but you know that my email address is rachel.mallard@lacity.org. So if there are additional comments you don't get in today, you can feel free to email them to me as we think about the next phases for this project and how we address this issue of canopy equity across our city. And with that, I think we'll end a little bit early today, short and sweet. So thank you for joining. And again, if you didn't get a chance to catch the LA Urban Center event, I highly recommend seeing Vivek and Cindy Chen's presentations that day, as well as, again, the really fascinating work being done by their other research fellows. All right, thank you so much. And we'll see you again on June 9th. And I will flag at this point that our other event for June, June 23rd would be our typical day, because we do the 2nd and 4th Wednesday for the Lunch and Learn series. In June, we'll be doing June 9th and June 30th. So we'll be pushing back to the 5th week of June for the 2nd Lunch and Learn next month. All right, I will see you all next time.